unilateral right to kick one out. To use an example, let's say that a fund manager does all the right diligence but doesn't know that a particular investor, there's a pending FBI investigation into them being involved in drug trafficking or organized crime or even terrorism. They would accept that person, that individual, or that institution into the program and wouldn't know any better. But we, Treasury, or our law enforcement partners could run those names in a database, kick something out, and then reject that investor. We wouldn't necessarily want to tell the PPIP fund manager and say, hey, by the way, we have a pending criminal investigation into one of your clients, because it might be pending. But I still think it's important that Treasury have the ability to unilaterally knock those types of folks out of it. And that's a recommendation we've made and has not been adopted.
Well, let me just end up by asking this question. The Tarp funds that have been allocated by Congress does not reach the $3 trillion level. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think they're going to ask for another bailout?
Congressman, I don't have that crystal ball.
Do you think it's going to be needed? Do you think additional funds will be required to meet their obligations or the requirements?
I really can't answer that question. I don't know. I think there's a lot in question of what's going to happen in the economy in the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months, the next year, and I'm just not in a position to really.
What would your recommendation be?
I think right now Treasury has stated that they don't need additional funds. So I think at this point I assume that's where we are.
Right. Gentleman's time has expired. Now yield to a senior member of Congress, not in age but in years of service, Marcy Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much, and happy birthday. This is just the beginning of your life. Mr. Borowski, thank you so very much. You have a really important job on behalf of the American people and your staff, and we thank you for that.
Thank you.
First question, what more can we do to help you do your job?
Congress has been amazingly supportive of our agency since we've begun, and we really have, I think, all the necessary tools in place right now.
All right. Your report came out today. Most members of Congress have not had a chance to digest it and take it apart. Would you be willing to come back, or your staff, and help us ferret out some of the information we feel we still need in its interpretation? Would you be willing to do that?
Of course. At any time, my staff will be available to brief your staff, and any time this committee or any of the subcommittees want to hear our testimony, we will always be available. We're a creation of Congress, and it's part of our job is to inform the American people through its representatives of everything that's going on. So, of course.
All right. Now, you have a hotline, 877-SIG-2009. Your report states you received over 3,000, I think, 3,200 tips from the American people. That hotline is available to the American people if they work for one of these hotshot companies and they were involved in activity that they've now reflected on might not have been cricket and above board. They can report that to you, can't they?
Yes, and they can also and should also go to our website if they don't want to use the phone, www.sigtarp.gov. This has been a crucially important aspect of what we do. More than half of our criminal investigations have been initiated by tips from the hotline. So people are using it, and we really strongly encourage.
So some of those tips are good?
Some of the tips are very good.
All right. So the American people have to muscle up here as well. And I think the fact it's a free phone number, 877-SIG-2009, people ought to use it. And this was networked across the country, and there's knowledge all across America, and we need to pull it together. I can tell you in my region of northern Ohio, mortgage foreclosures are going up, unemployment is going up, and 4 businesses told me this weekend they can't get credit, and these are excellent businesses. The system is not working at the grassroots level in Ohio. My major, and I voted against the Tarp, I voted against the bailout, because I thought that it wasn't the right means to resolve a crisis inside the mortgage system. We'd done that before, back in the 80s. When we used mark-to-market accounting, we actually went into the books of troubled institutions using FDIC examiners and SEC accounting. Accountants, so you had accountants plus bank examiners in there, and the burden was not put on the American people. This is back when Continental Bank failed in Illinois, when all the banks in Texas went down but for one. So when they came up with this concoction of this particular means, vesting all this power in Treasury and ramrodded it through Congress here 6 weeks before an election, I have to tell you I became very, very suspicious, and I still am. And one of my questions to you is, you talk about you've had background in your own life in mortgage fraud. Have you ever had a background in control fraud and systemic fraud?
I don't know how much control fraud or systemic fraud, as sort of cases are concerned. I've certainly been involved in securities fraud of some truly, systematically, would probably today be considered systematically significant institutions, and looked at some of the accounting frauds and frauds that those companies have committed.
I would urge you very much to look at, of course, the Enron situation, who was hired, the staffing you're going to be doing, and if people at a high enough level, because this goes to the highest levels of finance and of institutional structures in our country, and ultimately it had international repercussions. But I would urge you to look at the Enron situation and to think about the kind of staff that you might hire up in the additional authorities that you have been given.
Well, it's funny you mention that, because we just recently brought on, I prosecuted the REFCO matter, and we just recently brought on as one of our attorney advisors one of the prosecutors on the WorldCom matter. So we are gearing up with that in mind.
All right, very good. One of the most insightful people I've read on this is Mr. Bill Black out of the University, I think it's Missouri, Kansas City, and he had worked for the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation back in the early 90s. I don't believe he's for hire, but I'm just saying his way of thinking about what went on is very, very useful, and I wish to share that with you. I also want to put two issues out there. One is warrants, and my deep concern about, for instance, Goldman Sachs and their warrants. It's my understanding that the American people have the right to 12.2 million shares of Goldman, according to the numbers that I have. And Goldman actually has the privilege under the agreement of determining when our taxpayers have to sell those warrants and exercise their rights. So they control the price and they control the timing. I think it's really important on the warrant issue that you examine these warrant potentials, sales prices, and the timing of this for the American people, because the other day the price was $1.60 a share, and apparently Goldman was saying, well, we'll sell to you for $122.9. That difference yields $450 million. If we were to sell today, what if we held it for 9 years? Nobody's asking those questions as far as I know, and I'm very concerned that the American people with Goldman and all these other companies get their money back plus.
We have an ongoing audit into exactly these issues on the warrant repurchase process. So that is something that is pending that we're looking at.
All right. And, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to say for the record, I don't have time to ask on the PPIP program, but what troubles me, Mr. Borowski, is some of the very individuals, forget the company names like BlackRock, but the people who were involved in inventing the mortgage subprime instrument, then moving it to market, changing it from a bond to a security, and then creating the derivative instruments, changed the companies they were in. But now they're the same people that have gone to the Fed and they've gotten these contracts. I really think you need to look at people and where they were in the system over the last 20 years and what impact that has had now on our economy and who's in place, in my mind, with potential power to cover over some of their own very bad mistakes. And I would urge you to look at those firms closely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the tune of $23.7 trillion worth of taxpayer exposure for the bailouts is quite striking and frightening. I appreciate your testimony and your frankness, and I'm grateful that the President has not fired you like he's fired 2 other Inspector Generals.
Me too.
What's that?
I said me too.
Yeah, that's true. But I do think it is a big concern that the administration is choosing to remove Inspectors General because you, as well as your colleagues within various Inspector General offices across government do a yeoman's task of making sure the government's accountable to the taxpayer. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to yield to the ranking member the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman. And following up on that line, in your current capacity, I'll bring to your attention that, according to the Wall Street Journal, some of the private fund managers selected to participate in the PPIP may have consulted informally to the Obama administration in in writing the PPIP itself. In other words, they wrote what they now participate on, which is not surprising. Additionally, the New York Times reports that BlackRock CEO Lawrence Fink, who has been chosen as one of the PPIP fund managers, is a member of Larry Summers' inner circle. The program lets him select fund managers that use 75% of the taxpayers' money and assets. My question to you is, if in fact this and other activities begin to look like a cordial relationship where information is being passed, positions are being given because of friendships of people that go in and out of government, are you in a position to investigate that?
Well, I think that, certainly any type of corruption is squarely within our mandate. But the points that you raise, I think, go so importantly to what we were discussing earlier as far as the reputational risk to Treasury. If, in fact, these individuals had a hand in writing these programs, it all becomes all the more important that from a perception area alone, that we have the tightest and most significant ethical barriers and informational barriers and walls to prevent them from taking advantage of a program that they may have had a hand in creating.
Well, Mr. Borofsky, you've been criticized a little bit for this $23.7 trillion, as we entered in the record earlier, because these are assurances, and partially because it's outside of the TARP itself. How many IGs would have to be at your table if we were to cover all the guarantees, assurances, promises, underwriting that the government's doing? How many different parts of government would we be dealing with here?
Well, if you go through our chart and count up the institutions, I don't have the number at hand, but certainly the FDIC, Federal Reserve, Pension Guarantee, National Credit Union, basically a financial services roundtable of IGs.
So if we can't fit them all at the present table, and the Chairman has not yet said we're going to increase the size of the witness table, then is it fair for us to consider here the fact that when we created your position, we created a position thinking in terms of $700 billion in TARP. Today, we're thinking in terms of the financial recovery and oversight process that now has a dozen or more IGs loosely associated, not able to coordinate their activities, at least by design. Do you believe that either yourself or either your position or another position should be created that would be the IG for financial oversight, that would be able to bridge all these various IGs so that, in fact, our systemic risk, which is $23.7 trillion of risk, could, in fact, be overseen in a coordinated way?
I think the most vital thing that I have as an Inspector General, and being obviously brand new to the Inspector General system coming here last December.
But not to the inspector part of it.
No, is my independence. The independence is the most vital thing for an Inspector General. And I think the problem when you have these coalition of IGs, I think it's very important for us to coordinate with one another. In the TARP, I formed a TARP IG Council. So all the different IGs that touch on TARP programs, we meet monthly and we talk about audits and investigations. We have subcommittees. And I think that type of coordination is very good. But I'll tell you, we also have, in fact, I'll be going on Thursday to a regulatory IG. There's a monthly lunch. So we are coordinating with each other. I think putting umbrella over other inspectors general, I think that almost invariably will impinge on their independence. I think we are coordinating and should continue to do so.
In fairness, since we're seeing you, it is important that you be able to give us, if you will, the result of that coordination so that we're looking at the entire financial oversight as we are here today. Let me just ask you one closing question. In the case of Chrysler, it has been reported, and I believe this to be true, that we've given up $3.8 billion worth of DIP financing, meaning we gave them the money out of TARP in order to go through a process. We then sold them and took back nothing in return. Is that something that needs to be investigated as to whether or not it was necessary to write off nearly $4 billion of the last money into Chrysler?
Yes, our report, we detail those numbers of what's been waived, both in Chrysler and in General Motors, and what's been received on the other side, including equity interest. I think that sort of the facts are what they are on that, and are certainly open to any fair inquiry as to how we got to that situation.
Okay, so perhaps it's for us to decide whether it's worth investigating now that you've given us the facts.
Yes, or it is certainly something that we can look into potentially, or one of our oversight partners as part of an audit as to what that decision-making process was.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Gentleman from North Carolina, time has expired. I now yield to the gentlewoman from California, Congresswoman Watson.
Mr. Chairman, I want to say to you on your birthday that yesterday is the past, tomorrow is the future, but today is a gift from God. That's why it's called the present. Happy birthday, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your kind words.
I want to get back to the Bank of America, and thank you so much, Mr. Boyarsky, for being here and being so open with us. According to recent reports, Bank of America is now trying to avoid paying billions of dollars in fees to the U.S. taxpayers in return for the $118 billion in guarantees they received from the federal government. According to the B of A, the agreement was never signed, but the guarantees have been announced as part of the assistance they received to complete the acquisition of Merrill Lynch. Do you believe that the Bank of America benefited from increased investor confidence because of the perception that they had federal ring fencing of their toxic assets?
I really am reluctant to comment on, as Inspector General, on an ongoing negotiation between Treasury and Bank of America. I think that the events are what they are on that, but I think it may be crossing a line as an agency if we start publicly commenting on something that's an ongoing negotiation. So respectfully, I would ask for your permission not to have to answer that question.
We had the former Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Polson, in here for 5 hours last week. It was like trying to unscramble rotten eggs, and it's very frustrating to us. Has the Treasury Department provided an explanation for why they did not require Bank of America to join the Asset Guaranteed Program Agreement? Do you know?
We haven't gotten that explanation. We've been monitoring the program since it was its announcement, and we've got a little bit of information, basically, that there's been ongoing discussions. We have an audit coming out, I think, that tracks a lot of the fine work of this committee on the Bank of America and its participation in the various TARP programs, which we'll be presenting in September. And I would be happy at that time to come back to the committee and discuss its findings if the committee would think that would be helpful.
Yes, I would ask the chair to hold up a follow-up meeting in due time so that we can follow up on some of this, because you lead right into my next question I wanted to ask. And have you discovered any other large-scale agreements of the federal government which the federal government has entered into with financial institutes without valid contracts to enforce the proper repayment of the taxpayers' investments? So this is a question that you can keep in mind for our follow-up meeting. I do hope we can set that sometime in the very near future. Also, let me see, in your April quarterly report, you noticed the risk of conflicts of interest and collusion vulnerabilities inherent in the design of the Public-Private Investment Program, a PPIP. However, the Treasury Department has declined to adopt your recommendation to impose an informational barrier between the employees who do or do not handle PPIP funds at the time these funds, the PPIP fund managers, at the 9 PPIP fund managers. Can you comment on that, or should we wait for a subsequent meeting?
No, absolutely. We think that this is a fundamental deficiency in the current structure of the PPIP program. We think that it is absolutely essential that there be an informational barrier or ethical wall that prevents the fund manager's firm from taking advantage of confidential market-moving information that the fund managers are going to have. We think it's a problem, and we think it's a deficiency in the program.
Thank you. And why do you believe the Treasury Department is unwilling to impose the measure despite having placed similar restrictions on asset managers in comparable federal bailout-related programs?
Treasury has provided to us, and we've included in our report, a very detailed written description of their justifications and reasoning. In our report, we address each of those and show why we disagree with them. One of them, that it's impractical, that the design of the program doesn't make it susceptible to such walls, and it may very well be that the program is fundamentally flawed in its design, in such a way that in its current structure it may be impractical. Our response is that because this is such an important issue, for such a variety of reasons, that if it's impractical with the current 9 fund managers, well then before selecting these 9 fund managers, Treasury should have changed its criteria or did what was necessary to put in the necessary walls to protect the taxpayer.
My time is up, and Mr. Chairman, I would hope that in our subsequent hearing with Mr. Bryarsky that we can get these recommendations and get some ideas about how you would assess the standard functions of such a department. So thank you. And are we going to recess?
No, we're going to continue all the way through. Just to give you an update, the House is in recess, which makes it good for us.
Oh, great.
We can continue.
Okay.
We're not in recess. When the House is in recess, that's when we really do our work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to join the committee in congratulating you on your birthday, and all of us were witnesses to how quickly you blew out that candle, so maybe we can negotiate with Mr. Waxman for a carbon credit for you on that item, okay? First of all, I watched this morning, Mr. Borowski, the way you were attacked for releasing this committee. And I'd just like to say to you as one member of this committee, thank you for giving us the hard, cold facts. And I just hope that you remember that when you get attacked like that, when basically because you brought a message a lot of people didn't want to hear in this town, contrary to public belief, the ancient Egyptian tradition was to always send your best people to give bad news. Because the guys who were sent with the good news were sacrificed to thank the gods for the good news. So it should be a credit to you to understand that you're attacked because you are bringing this up. And I want to thank you very much for that. And I'm sure this, not just this committee, but the public at large is going to thank you for your report. The hard, cold facts do get into trouble. Speaking of footprints, the whole concept of looking at BlackRock and some of these the 9 players here, where the footprint of the federal government of picking winners in this whole game. Do you have any idea, or and if you don't and you need to have time, I understand, because you can get back to us in writing, how did these 9 major players get chosen as the winners in this game to be blessed not just by the bureaucracy of the federal government, but by all the taxpayers in the federal government? How did these 9 players become the winners in this game as opposed to the other losers that were pointed out by the former mayor of Cleveland, Mr. Kucinich?
The Treasury's explanation is that they put out applications. They received about 140 applications. The next step was to remove duplicative applications or incomplete, and that came down to 102. They then applied the criteria, which they've put out on their website, of what they were looking for in the ideal asset managers. And basically, those that didn't meet that cut, I think they narrowed the number down to 13. They then did a series of interviews, and it ended up with the final 9. I think those are the numbers. I think the exact numbers are likely reflected in our report. And that is essentially how Treasury has described their process.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just think this report really, again, reinforces the fact that we have ventured into a very, very scary territory, a brave new world where Washington decides what happens on Wall Street and Main Street. And hopefully we can somewhere in the future find a way to have an exit strategy and remove ourselves from imposing our footprint over the rest of American society. And I thank you very much for this report, because I think it's a dose of reality to make all of us work together here. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Inspector General. It's a pleasure to have you before us, and in your short time, you have done an extraordinary job, and we thank you on behalf of the American people.
Thank you.
Let me first ask this question. Did any bank you surveyed not participate by returning the survey?
No, we had 100% participation.
All right, very good. Should we pass legislation to require the tracking of TARP funds, since evidently it was not required in the actual providing of the TARP monies?
We believe that requiring recipients to account for their use of funds is a fundamentally important part of transparency. It's why we make this recommendation, continue to make this recommendation. As a policy, we tend not to cross into the policy recommendations as to what Congress should do or what Treasury should do. We do say what Treasury should do, but we don't suggest legislation for Congress just as a policy matter and to maintain our independence. But we certainly do feel it is our obligation to present to you why we think it's such an important factor of transparency.
Now, did the contracts that the Treasury devised with the banks for the distribution of the TARP funds prohibit the use of the money for any purpose?
Different contracts and different programs. There are some restrictions on stock buybacks, on in the capital purchase program, on certain restrictions on increasing the level of dividends. So there are some restrictions, although not many.
So the fact that they would use the money to make investments, repay debts, or buy other banks was all legal under the granting of the TARP funds?
Absolutely.
All right. Should we change that?
That is as I said, that is a real policy decision that needs to get made. I think in making that decision, we should take a look at both sides of these arguments. And part of the role of transparency as a Special Inspector General is that we think that these debates are best informed by bringing transparency so we can see what happened. But I can give you arguments that I've heard on both sides of any one of these issues, including, I think one of the more controversial is acquisitions. And I've heard some very powerful, strong arguments that that's actually good for the banking system, and arguments on the other side that it would be an inappropriate use of TARP funds.
Let's talk about acquisitions. Which banks actually took the TARP money and made acquisitions?
We're going to be publishing necessarily in some redacted form each of the responses that we received. And the reason why I say redacted is that there's some confidential business information that we'd be prohibited by law from making public. Since we're still in the process of that, I'm reluctant to comment on any specific response that we had. We will be making that information public, hopefully within the next 30 days.
And in terms of alarms that go off in your head because of what you have been able to ascertain through your surveys, what are those alarms that we should be particularly focused on?
I don't think that there's any alarming, because I think when we did this survey, we're taking great care not to make any judgments for all the reasons that I've stated. The most alarming thing to me is that Treasury continues to refuse to adopt this recommendation, even in light of the proof that we now have in this audit. They continue to tell us that it is a meaningless survey, even though no one from Treasury has taken us up on our offer to come look at these survey responses, an unredacted form. We said, come over, take a look at them, and see if you think that these are meaningless responses that can't provide transparency. So I think the most alarming to me is this steadfast refusal, this willful refusal to adopt a recommendation that we think is so important to provide transparency.
So you're saying that even though you now have over 360 surveys that provide information on how the TARP funds have been used, no one from the Treasury Department has come over to look at this information?
No, their refusal to adopt our recommendation was made purely off of our audit report. They have not come over.
I think that's astonishing. Are you back?
Thank you very much. I now yield to Congressman Shook from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Likewise, happy birthday on your special day. And just noticing your election to office in 1983, and someone who's 28 years old in Congress, that's a lifetime. So thank you for your service to this Congress and your country. Happy birthday. Mr. Borofsky, I'm specifically interested in the change in purpose that has occurred under the new administration with the use of TARP funds, and how that might change your role or add additional responsibilities, or how your responsibility as the Special Inspector General for TARP interfaces with our federal government's decision to bail out the automakers. Could you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I think that in the near term, we're addressing that through our audit function. We've announced an audit of corporate governance, which of course oversees the fact that we do have a controlling interest in General Motors now, controlling equity interest, and minority interest in Chrysler Financial. My team is going to be heading out to Detroit next week, some of my audit team, to start that process. We're also going to be sending representatives of our investigative division as well to make the necessary context, make sure that the word is out, including word about our hotline if anyone within these companies knows of any misrepresentations. There's a whole bunch of reporting that's required as a condition of the federal funds. So we're going to keep a very close eye and dedicate the necessary resources to fulfill our oversight role.
So you feel you're being given the latitude you need in terms of allowing your personnel into GM and Chrysler to oversee the use of those TARP funds?
I'll let you know next week, but I don't anticipate that we're going to have a problem.
Okay. The next question is your opinion. When this bill was sold to Congress last fall, it was sold on it was predicated on the idea that this money, in the words of former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, would be, if not all paid back, most of it, and there was a slim likelihood that we might actually make money on the TARP money for the taxpayers. Do you believe that the majority of this money will be paid back?
I think if you look at the way the program has evolved, I think it's extremely unlikely that we're going to get $700 billion back. The mortgage modification program alone is $50 billion. There's no anticipation that any of that money will come back. That money is being directly given to mortgage servicers to help convince them to lower mortgage payments and payments that they'll make on behalf of homeowners. So I think it's very unlikely that TARP will turn a profit significant enough on other activities to generate a profit to cover that $50 billion. In addition, on some of the other programs, as Ranking Member noted, the money has been written off from Chrysler. Still have to see what happens with our equity interest in those companies. So it's certainly possible that more may be retained or earned back over time than maybe even we suspect right now. But I think the idea of getting a dollar-for-dollar return would be extremely unlikely.
And then specifically about your conversation, your statements earlier about asking basically Treasury to detail or basically to collect information from TARP recipients and also the use of their taxpayer funds from those TARP recipients. In your view, why is it? I mean, Treasury kind of gives this response that, well, that would be meaningless and really is not necessary. What's your view of that?
Well, first of all, if it were meaningless, I don't understand why Treasury does this with respect to Bank of America, Citigroup, and AIG. Are they including, recently with AIG, are they including conditions in their contracts that they believe are meaningless? I certainly hope not. My view is that sure, money is fungible, and that is a true concept, but just to use a simple example from my own life, I get direct deposit of my federal paycheck, and while normally I couldn't tell you whether if I buy some groceries, whether it's from one week or a different week, because money is fungible, all goes into my checking account. A couple of years ago when I won the John Marshall Award for my work on the Revco case, there's a small cash component. And I knew that was going to be direct deposited into my checking account. And before I got that check, I knew what I was going to do with that money. I was going to pay off a piece of my student loan. So when I got it, and sure enough, the money came into my account and then went out to pay off the student loan. Mm-hmm. So sure, money is fungible, but I could tell you with a great deal of certainty what I did with that bonus money, that extra money that came in. And what we see is that financial institutions have been able to do the exact same thing. The TARP was an extraordinary amount of money and an extraordinary investment. And banks can tell what they did with that money. Banks, they're responsible companies. They're budgeting for the fact they're increasing the capital by these amounts. And this is all money that can be verified and tested. So much of Treasury's compliance system is based on similar types of self-reporting, where financial institutions report their compliance, and then Treasury comes back and hopefully one day will test through its compliance function. This is no different. If a bank says, I used the money to acquire another financial institution, which I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise because I wouldn't have had enough money, that's certainly a verifiable fact. If they go buy agency mortgage-backed securities and say this is what we did with the money, we can look at what their total volume of securities were before the TARP money and afterwards and test that money. So we do believe that this is an important part of transparency. It's important for the members of Congress, for the American people, and it's important for Treasury as well to know what's going on with the taxpayer funds.
I agree. Thank you very much for your testimony, and I hope you'll continue to press on.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Shock's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Congressman Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barassi, thank you for your great work. I appreciate the work being done by Mr. Dodaro and Elizabeth Warren as well. The work that you do obviously allows us on the Oversight Committee to do a lot of our work. Let me ask you, one of the programs that Treasury has set up was this asset guarantee program, where Treasury will guarantee certain toxic assets held by qualifying financial institutions. They have focused mainly on toxic assets purchased by, or held by, excuse me, Bank of America and Citigroup. I think those are the two big outfits that they focused on. Have you been able to get information on the specific assets that Treasury has acquired from Citibank and Bank of America?
We're in the process of putting together an audit that's going to address exactly that question. We received a letter request from Congress to look into that, and we are right now in the process of putting together the audit structure that's going to address exactly that issue of what's in there, what the cash flows are, how it came to be, really a thorough audit on the entire process and what's going on in the Citigroup. For Bank of America, Ken Lewis has indicated, the CEO of Bank of America, that they are withdrawing from that program, that the contract was never signed, and therefore it's not actually going to be imposed. So we do have a pending audit that we expect to complete in September that addresses Bank of America and its participation in the TARP program. So we'll touch on that there, but we won't be doing a similar study of the assets given the change of the status of that program. Okay.
I know this was instituted in November of 2008. And I'm just wondering, what actually was purchased. And my question really focuses on our potential exposure. If we're providing a guarantee behind a credit default swap or some complex derivative, our exposure may be greater than what your monetary assessment has been, even at $3 trillion, and I'm just worried about our exposure there. Let me just shift, and I certainly anticipate your report in September. That will be great. Let me ask you about your own position here. We originally set up the Special Inspector General for TARP in connection with the $700 billion that was allocated. I did not vote for that, but it went through anyway. A lot of us didn't. Now, originally, you were set up to oversee and to safeguard the taxpayers' money. However, recently I understand that Treasury has challenged your authority as an independent oversight body. Reportedly, Treasury has requested an opinion from the Justice Department, Office of Legal Counsel, questioning whether your office, in fact, falls under Treasury's authority. And can you comment on Treasury's challenge to your independence, which you talked about earlier as being so important and integral to your operation there?
Yes, we do think this is potentially an issue that could impair our independence. Treasury has sought this legal advice from OLC. We've submitted our own submission detailing our position that we think it's crystal clear what Congress's intent was, and that was for us to be an independent agency operating within the Treasury Department. And we're going to wait and see, but we think that there is a danger that Treasury could try to assert, depending on what the OLC opinion is, the authority to shut down investigations or audits that we may seek to initiate. And we think that would obviously be contrary to the intent of Congress, and it's something certainly we'll let Congress know if we do get an adverse opinion. I'm pretty confident, though, that I think the statute is so clear and the intent of Congress is so clear. I'm hopeful that OLC will see it the right way. I think really the only way that makes sense based on how the statute is written and what the statements of Congress have been both at the time of enactment and since then, and hopefully this issue goes away. I always thought this was an unnecessary thing for Treasury to do. I continue to think so.
Well, obviously, if this challenge is diverting the energies of your staff to defend itself, then perhaps we in this committee can, I mean, there are some vehicles that are going through Congress right now. We could simply amend one of those just to clarify that our intent was that you be independent and that you conduct oversight over the operations of Treasury in connection with this Tarp program. Let me ask you, I also heard that Treasury's decision to challenge this came immediately in response to some of your questions regarding the bonus payouts at AIG. Is that correct?
That was the timing. I wouldn't go so far as to do causal relationship between the two because I don't know for sure. It did come up, the issue, on the eve of an interview that we were going to have with a member of Treasury's General Counsel's office who was involved in the executive compensation issue at AIG. So it certainly was at that time.
Well, I only speak for myself, and I know my time has expired, but I just want to say that I think it would be a terrible miscarriage of what Congress's intent was to have you hamstrung by being put under Treasury. We established your office to oversee and to protect taxpayer money, and we do not expect you to be answering to Treasury. We expect you to be investigating them and conducting your oversight. Thank you. I yield back, right. Mr. Chairman, and happy birthday.
No, you can't yield back. You don't have any. Congressman Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Borofsky, welcome. Thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you.
You've made the news with $23.7 trillion pronouncement in your report. I'd like to ask you to unpack that further. That clearly, obviously, is the fullness of potential of taxpayer liability, the exposure, potential exposure to taxpayer liability. Many of us have been operating off a working assumption that total taxpayer liability was about $12 trillion, that between the Fed and the FDIC as well as the Treasury Department totaled about $12 trillion. Now, the other number that I thought was significant that you said was about $4 trillion of that is actual realized expenditures. So two questions, and let's just try to break this down into categories that are manageable. Tell the American people where that taxpayer liability is located, to whom it is, to whom it has been gifted, basically, and then again under the $4 billion actual realized expenditures, to whom is that going and in what form? Direct expenditures, loans, guarantees, by whom, to whom?
Your question actually encapsulates why we made this an entire section of our report, because it's obviously some very, very complicated issues here. And in Section 3 of this report, we do that breakdown. We talk about each of the numbers that we're talking about, the $3 trillion that's currently outstanding, the $4.7 trillion that has been expended or guaranteed in total, including money that's been paid back and canceled programs from the initiation of the crisis through June 30th, and then the $23.7 trillion number, which is the maximum number if every one of these programs was subscribed to the highest amount, every guarantee was done. And the purpose of this really wasn't to make the news or to make a splash. What we did here is we took the 50 programs, because we thought it was important to show what the 50 programs were, in addition to TARP, that address the government's support of the financial system. And really this $23.7 trillion, which has generated so much controversy and so much comment from the Treasury Department, is just adding up the number of what the total high water mark is for each of those 50 programs. And that's what's reflected in here. So it isn't that the taxpayer is on the hook right now for $23.7 trillion. We don't say that and we don't suggest it. But that is the maximum if you take all of the programs that have been initiated since the inception of the financial
that's the total
crisis.
potential exposure. But again, let's get back. Let's try to frame that a little bit more concisely. This is 250 pages. The particular section you're referring to, I don't know how many pages is that. I don't know if you have a particular chart that, again, categorizes this in broad terms so that we can all have a working framework that is usable so that we can understand, again, the total liability that exists and actually where it's going.
Table 3.4 on page 138, and I would say that any taxpayer or anyone interested, this report is at our website, www.sigtarp.gov, where anyone can download this and see all the facts. But if you look at page 138, that has a table which is entitled Incremental Financial System Support. And what we've done here is we've taken, there's been some existing programs that were increased. So we haven't included the total program, but only the increase that is attributable to the financial crisis. And what we have here is it lists the different sources of where the guarantees or support are coming from, and lists what the current balance is, the maximum balance from inception, and what the total potential support is. And that's the phrase I think is the right one, is total potential support. Now, each of these entries in here, and we list the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, Treasury TARP, Treasury non-TARP, and then others, is supported subsequently in the report by other charts. So, for example, if you wanted to see what the Federal Reserve portion of this is, you just turn the next page, and in Table 3.5, we list each of the Federal Reserve programs that's described, and again, with the same information, the current balance, the maximum balance, and the total support related to the crisis. And what you do when you add up each of these charts and the total support, that's where the $23.7 trillion number comes from.
Now, out of this, about $16 trillion is between the Federal Reserve, Treasury, and the FDIC. Again, the operating assumption that we've been working off of for basically the balance of this year, because there was no numbers available, easily available, was 12. And so that's a very significant increase.
And that's one of the reasons why we've done this. And we've come under some criticism for having done this, but every time that we would look at a different article or a different newspaper, there'd be a different number there. And we thought it was important to put the TARP in context to collect what the major numbers were. And that's what we've tried to do here.
What level of detail does it go into in terms of actual recipients of these various funds between FDIC, Treasury, as well as the Federal Reserve?
Well, we had a page limit, so and because ultimately this is TARP in context, and given the number of these programs, what we've done is really a 1 or 2 paragraph summary of each program. That further information, and also everything that's in here is based on publicly available information. This is all stuff that we got off the websites or congressional testimony of the different agencies. Getting into the recipients I think in a large part would be, in many cases, beyond what's publicly available, and frankly, beyond our jurisdiction or authority, because these are non-TARP related.
The gentleman from Nebraska's time has expired. Thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Turney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Browski, for the work that you're doing and for being here today. I just have 2 lines of questioning that shouldn't take too long. One concerns the Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facility, the so-called TELF. This is an idea where they need a AAA rating from 2 of the rating firms and a not less than AAA rating from the 3rd firm. But we continue to have these rating agencies paid by the issuers, by the people whose product they're rating. Now, you made mention of that in your report. You said essentially they are, and I quote, paid by the issuers of the very securities that they're rating. As a result, the agency has an incentive to issue a high rating to attract future business from that issuer, close quote. And that's one of the problems that got us where we are today in this whole financial crisis. It should boggle our minds that we're continuing down that path and then even relying on those as part of this program. So you would agree, obviously, that we should be concerned about this, but moreover, what do you suggest we should do as a different methodology for the TELF program and others?
Well, this is something we've been pushing through since our first initial report to Congress in February. And we have some suggestions in the report. One of our concerns is a race to the bottom. Moody's has actually came out, one of the 3 rating agencies, and has said basically that they're losing business because they've been more strict than the other 2, and as a result, they haven't been getting enough business. Now, we haven't investigated that. We think that the Federal Reserve and Treasury needs to investigate that further. But it sort of raises the ultimate issue of a potential race to the bottom. And then it was expanded. When the TALP went into commercial mortgage-backed securities, they added more rating agencies but kept the number at 2 that are required to get approval. That, to us, only exacerbates the issue of more rating agencies for that race to the bottom to occur. I think what they need to do is what the Federal Reserve, to their credit, has started to do, which is stop relying on rating agencies to do the work, the diligence, the underwriting that stands behind these asset-backed securities. So the Federal Reserve has hired a collateral monitor for commercial mortgage-backed securities to come up with its own evaluations as to what these things might be worth in a stressed environment. And we think that it's important to keep pushing in that direction, away from reliance or the importance of rating agencies in this process, to make sure when we're dealing at least with taxpayer money that the level of protection is a little bit higher than what, as you correctly state, got us into this soup in the first place.
What can Congress do to help you push that point? Because obviously we're not going to have somebody other than the issuer pay, then we should do exactly what the Fed is doing in this program.
I mean, I don't think that, you know, it's not really our policy to advise Congress on specific legislation on these policy issues.
But saying that legislation would be the only thing we could do, or one of the things we could do, whatever, would be helpful generally.
I think it also is sort of worth noting that in the regulatory reform that obviously this Congress is considering, taking a good hard look at what the reforms are for the rating agencies and whether the reforms truly and squarely address these conflicts of interest that had such disastrous consequences leading into the financial crisis.
Thank you. My other line of question has to deal with the credit derivative contracts that AIG held with third-party counterparties. The financial situation when it occurred obviously created a situation where the counterparties claimed that the contract terms had been violated. They demanded either payment or additional collateral from AIG. AIG's lack of liquidity obviously made that difficult to come up with, and there was a contest between AIG and those third-party people as to whether or not there was money owed. If so, how much should it be? And there was a negotiation that was going on that. When Mr. Liddy from AIG was before the committee, we asked him why it was they paid 100% on the claim. And he said that he didn't believe they necessarily should have, that in fact there was a contention amongst that, and he had been somewhat surprised, but he and the people at AIG hadn't done it. That in fact it had been the Fed and the New York branch in particular that had done it. Are you looking at that at all, and are you able to tell us what happened that all of a sudden in contested claims they just up and forked over 100%?
We are looking at that. We have a pending audit into that very specific issue, the credit party payments and the payment of 100 cents on the dollar, and who made that decision. I expect that audit will be finalized by September.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
Just one quick follow-up. Are you familiar with the XBRL, and are you in a position to help get this kind of transparency database access available to agencies that currently are not reporting in a transparent fashion?
We are familiar with the XBLR product. I heard some testimony about it, and when actually my office received a presentation on it, and it does appear to be a useful type of product to track these types of funds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Right. I yield to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank Congressman Issa for the letter that he gave to me. You know, we had Mr. Paulson and Mr. Bernanke before the committee just in the last couple of weeks, and they had an epidemic of memory loss on a number of issues. And Mr. Paulson was working, of course, very closely with Mr. Geithner, the now Secretary of Treasury, on a number of issues, as well as Mr. Bernanke. And you know, this whole pattern really kind of bothers me about how they've appeared to keep things from the Congress of the United States because they can't remember who did what on the Merrill Lynch deal with Bank of America, and now Geithner's worked with Paulson, and now they're in effect threatening you. I mean, I don't see how anybody can get anything out of this letter that we received other than they were putting the hammer to you to back off. You say here that on April 15th, Mr. Knight wrote to the OLC over at the Justice Department attaching a copy of SIG Tarp's April 7th memorandum regarding the presented issues. And they were asking whether or not you should fall under the jurisdiction or control of the Treasury Department. It's pretty clear to, I think, everybody on this committee that you should be independent because that's what your job is. But then there was some kind of correspondence between you and the Department of Justice, and they asked you to redact a portion of the email exchanged from OLC. That was to you, right?
Initially, I think all of the information that our correspondence that oh yes, I'm sorry, yes, the response from OLC to us, which then generated an additional response from Treasury, yes, that was, we were asked to redact that.
Why? I wonder why they asked you to redact that. Did they give you a reason?
The stated reason from OLC is that it was, the information was indicative of their current thinking on an uncompleted matter, therefore that it was privileged information, and that until they came to a final resolution, they didn't want...
Well, you know, I was chairman of this committee for 6 years, and I worked with the Justice Department on a number of occasions, a lot of occasions, as a matter of fact, and they didn't give any information out or send any correspondence whatsoever that would have to be redacted. And the reason they didn't is because until they made a final determination, they didn't want any information out there in the hinterlands. And so when they sent you this information, and then they tell you that, that it has to be redacted, it seems to me that that's once again working with the Treasury Department to kind of to keep the hammer on you and hold things in abeyance so that you'll walk the chalk. You have any comment on that?
I really can't.
I didn't think you could.
Unfortunately, but
you know, I think this is such a blatant attempt to intimidate you, and I am so happy that you contacted Chairman or Ranking Member Issa and Senator Grassley, because what it's done is it's illuminated this issue so that these people that are trying to slow you down and not let this information get out in the public domain, they're going to be threatened by this right now. The only thing I would admonish you to do is to watch your back, because you, as I understand it, are subject to the President, and the President, you serve at his pleasure. And so I think, you know, there could be some reason they could come up with down the road that would get you replaced. But in the meantime, I want to congratulate you for having the intestinal fortitude, and I'd use some other terminology if I wasn't in public, to stand up for what you believe in. I think it's really great, and I'm glad you sent this letter to Mr. Issa. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I can assure you and I can assure this committee that I will not spend a single moment worrying about my job security or my future. I'm just going to continue to do the job that I've been hired to do, which is bring the complete transparency as possible and continue to audit and investigate to the best of my ability.
I have not met you before, but I like you, man.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah.
I've had a tough couple of days, so I appreciate that.
I'll be happy to yield.
One follow-up question. You know, so much has been said of this 23.7 trillion, plus or minus a trillion here or there, but because constitutionally we must authorize and appropriate monies, wouldn't it be fair to say that we need to have the transparency so we can anticipate in each fiscal year the likely outlays of additional money where risk is beginning to become recognized? Wouldn't that be something that this committee has to be able to access if we're going to allow the appropriators to make those funds available, presumably because additional losses may still occur in a number of markets, including the housing market?
I have to confess that I don't have an intimate knowledge of the emergency authorities that were invoked by the Federal Reserve and to a certain extent by the FDIC in authorizing these maximum amount, and what Congress's role is for authorizing them. So I'm not really sure what the constitutional
assuming that we
structure is.
believe that, currently, do we, in your opinion, are we getting that information, assuming that we believe we should appropriate monies in the years in which the loss occurs?
Well, I think from a looking back perspective, we've done our best to bring that information to your attention to the best that we can based on publicly available information.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me just say before I yield to the next gentleman from Missouri, I like you too. And let me just say that you also serve at the pleasure of the Congress as well. And I don't think you have a problem because the President has said that he's for transparency. Every conversation I've ever had with him, he talked about the importance of transparency. So to me, you should be in good shape.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and happy birthday.
Thank you very much. I now yield to the gentleman from Missouri, Congressman Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and happy birthday also.
I'm afraid this is making me even older.
Mr. Borowski, thank you for being here, and I look forward to your insight on questions that are asked frequently in Missouri's 1st Congressional District. I did not agree with the original thrust of TARP, and am still troubled by some results that I see. One of the most important reasons for the legislation was to provide liquidity for businesses and homeowners as the ultimate benefit of shoring up the banks and investment houses. We are seeing large banks and investment houses experiencing exorbitant profits, but no relaxation of credit, no significant increase in liquidity. Why hasn't liquidity been restored to small businesses and individual consumers as a result of stabilizing these lenders? And do you find that too much of the monies and profits are invested in Treasury bonds rather than in monies made available for lending?
I think that the lack of transparency and the failure to adopt our recommendations regarding requiring the recipients to report on their use of funds makes answering that question almost impossible. Until we know with some degree of precision exactly how the financial institutions are using the money, it's hard to answer the question of why they're not using it to increase lending, because we don't know what they are doing. In our survey, our audit report, which was just their responses to our survey, we've got a lot of answers that could lead to some conclusions. But that survey, of course, was from a certain point in time, basically March of this year. The banks that responded to the survey, 75% of them said that they had not yet allocated or spent all of their TARP funds. Since the time of the survey, another 200 institutions received TARP money, including insurance companies, which frankly I don't think anyone expects is going to be using the money as part of their banking subsidiaries that entitle them to receive TARP funds. So it's very difficult to answer the question of why are they not increasing lending if we don't know what they are actually doing with the money. And the only way we can get that on a more timely and regular basis is if Treasury adopts our recommendation and commits itself in deed as well as in word to maximum transparency.
In your crystal ball, do you suspect that they are perhaps paying out lucrative bonuses or paying off debt? I mean, what do you think is happening?
Well, based on what we saw from our snapshot back in March, they're certainly using it, a certain number are using it to pay off debt, and different types of debt. Some paying down lines of credit with the Federal Reserve with TARP funds. One smaller institution reported to us that in substance they were planning on using the TARP money for one purpose. I think it was to increase lending. But right around the time they got their TARP funds, they got called a line of credit that they had with another financial institution called in, and they ended up using substantially all of the TARP funds to make good on this money that they had borrowed from another financial institution that they might have had real trouble paying back but for the TARP funds. So we get glimpses, at least from the dates of our survey, as to what happened.
Well, on another subject, how do you see the private program of AIG, the systemically significant failing institution program, as having worked to the advantage of the taxpayers? AIG is the only company to receive funds under this program. We own 80% of the company, yet allow fire sales of the most valuable assets, which are on the insurance side of the company. Why do we do this?
That's a question I think is better addressed to Treasury than to myself. It's hard to calculate what would have, it's very hard to go back into the old Wayback Machine and know exactly what would have happened if we had not bailed out AIG through the Federal Reserve or through Treasury, and what the implications and ramifications would have been. Certainly from some folks' perspective, those who were responsible for the bailout and those at AIG warned that the consequences would have been disastrous. But of course it's hard to really know, to go back and know exactly what would have happened. What we have to do and will continue to do in our audits of AIG is to try to bring transparency to that decision-making process and transparency to what's happening over there, and we're going to continue to do so.
Who do you think are the recipients of these below-dollar deals?
For AIG, for the sale of AIG assets?
Yes.
I think AIG has disclosed some of their sale of assets, and to the extent that they have, those are included in our report.
Thank you so much for your answers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now yield to Congressman Drehas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me echo my colleagues in wishing you a happy birthday as well. Mr. Borowski, thank you very much for your testimony. I share the opinion of many of the members of the committee that you should, in fact, be independent, and that if there are challenges with Treasury, we should certainly be addressing those, because we value your independence and we certainly value the information that you've provided us here today. I too, like many of my colleagues, am astonished by the potential exposure that you have identified. And I guess I take a little different view. And I go back to how this may have been prevented, and am astonished that so few people are willing to look at the inaction and the failure of regulation to work properly to prevent the almost collapse of our financial markets. I, at the time, was not serving in Congress last fall when the markets nearly collapsed, but I said at the time that I would have reluctantly supported the Tarp, if only to stabilize the financial institutions. I subsequently voted against the second tranche of the Tarp because it didn't include many of the conditions on transparency that so many of my colleagues have talked about here today. But I go back, and I go back to the failure of Congress, the failure of previous administrations to regulate mortgage-backed securities, to regulate CDOs, to regulate CLOs, and while at the same time the banking industry was suggesting that they are the most regulated industry in the country, and there wasn't any need for us to move forward. And many of these same folks that are complaining about the exposure are also working against regulatory reform in financial services. So I'm struck by some of the comments that have been made by some of my colleagues. But specifically, I'd like to pursue a line of questioning regarding some of these toxic assets and the valuation of the toxic assets. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that I think was very interesting when they talked about collateralized debt obligation and the fact that, this was related to the mortgage-backed securities, which of course allowed the predatory lending to happen. But trying to pull all of these assets apart and value them in any real way is a Herculean task, because there is so little that is actually, in terms of collateral, in terms of capital, that's actually behind them. How do you, from your perspective, when looking at these toxic assets, how do you believe we can best value them?
I think that I too read the Wall Street Journal article, and the pulling apart of one of these CDOs squared, and I think it was a great illustration of the problem of these unbelievably complex securities and the challenge that Congress has in creating the right type of regulatory reform that will ensure oversight so that these types of transactions, these types of products don't wreak the damage that they did. I think the valuation issue is a very challenging one, and I think it's one that at first instance has got to be done by the Treasury itself, to the extent that they have these assets on their books, whether it's through an asset guarantee of Citigroup, whether it's in its own collection of assets. It's a very complicated structure that needs a great degree of expertise, and I think a great degree of skepticism. We'll also have to see what happens with the other programs whether these complex derivative products start coming across and being in the actual purchase programs or other subsequent TARP programs, where I think that issue will come even more to the front.
I realize your function is in evaluating the way in which the TARP monies are being spent. But as you look at it, and as you look at the causes of this financial collapse, can you offer advice as to moving forward, the type of regulation and the type of products that we should be looking to regulate as we move forward?
I think that one is a little bit outside of my lane. I think I would be uncomfortable offering opinion on that, because I think it's when it gets to the core issues of regulatory reform, I think it's fair for us to identify some areas like the role of credit rating agencies, because we're seeing that. But I think when you get into the nuts and bolts of regulatory reform, I would be uncomfortable offering my opinion.
Is it fair to say that much of the exposure that you have identified is due to a failure to regulate appropriately certain products?
I don't think that, short of an audit product or short of a more thorough examination of these causes, I would feel comfortable offering that opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Thank you very much. I now yield to the ranking member from California, Congressman Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm just going to close. I realize there's a second round, but we'll, on our side, we won't be asking for it. We would thank Mr. Borofsky. We will eliminate that. The fact is that you've been very generous with your time, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. I just want to close briefly, first of all, by thanking the Chairman. Secondly, by asking the Chairman, would he consider bringing the Treasury Secretary here next to help close the loop on a lot of these areas of transparency that I think Treasury deserves an opportunity to tell us from their perspective why they have not yet implemented these.
Chairman raised a good point, and we would definitely look into it.
And finally, in closing, I want to echo your words. When you said, in deed as well as in word, President Obama promised us an unparalleled level of transparency, and it's very clear that the bureaucracy that stands between President Obama and what he has told both the Chairman and myself and us is in the way. So in closing, and we look forward to having you back here again in a quarter, but I want to thank you for doing everything you can do to bring that level of transparency. And for myself, and the Chairman has already said for himself, we want to promise that we will be your partners in bridging that bureaucratic nightmare that always exists between a president like President Obama, who has promised us transparency, and the Congress, who begs for transparency, the IGs, who in fact help produce it, and the bureaucracy that stands in the way. So you have our support on a bipartisan basis. You will continue to have our support, because we agree with you that transparency, this light, is the only form of disinfectant that's going to prevent government waste. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for this series of very good oversight hearings. And I thank our witness and look forward to seeing you in about 90 days.
Thank you.
Back.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this, and we appreciate your endurance, Mr. Borofsky. I wanted to just state for the record that at least this member and many of the people she represents believe that this is the largest transfer of wealth in American history that we've ever seen, from those whose equity has been moved to Wall Street institutions that now have become even more concentrated as a result of what has occurred with the meltdown in the financial sector. And I just wanted to, again, share information. It's interesting to me that some of the companies like BlackRock that are involved in the resolution are headed by individuals who were heavily involved formally when they headed other companies in inventing the subprime instrument itself. And we don't know where they did all of their handiwork necessarily, but I find it very interesting that then now the federal government rewards them in very non-transparent processes. And I've said to myself, could they well be handling paper that they invented and trafficked 10 years ago or 15 years ago? The derivative instrument itself, I understand, was heavily influenced by a gentleman that is now the vice chair of PNC. And at our home in Ohio, I've just received a notice that our certificate of deposit that has been with National City Bank come this November is going to be transferred to PNC. I don't want PNC owning our meager assets. That isn't my choice. And yet I see this having an impact. Ohio now is only left with 3 money center banks. National cities disappearing. And I see this power gravitating elsewhere to the very people who caused this problem in the first place. One of my questions really has to do with Freddie Mac. And I could concentrate on Fannie Mae and FHA, because basically what's happened is all the bad paper is being dumped on the taxpayer, as you've well noted in your report, in different ways, putting it here, here, and every place else in the federal government, so it's not easily traceable. But if one looks at Freddie Mac, which is central in terms of being a dumpster as well as an enabler during the 1990s, let me just ask you why, when I looked at your report, I couldn't find the word Freddie Mac. Why have Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae's paper been hidden behind the walls of Oz over at the Federal Reserve? Do you have any role at all in unwinding the role of Freddie Mac in all of this going back into the 90s?
We don't have jurisdiction over Freddie Mac in any aspect other than the fact that Treasury has hired them as a financial agent to help do compliance for the mortgage modification program. But otherwise, because other than that, since Freddie Mac is not involved in Tarp specifically, we don't have jurisdiction over them.
I don't know if you're aware of this or if the public is aware of this, but Freddie Mac had over $500 million of fines placed on it already for fraudulent activity. And the fact is that they had, during the heyday of their nefarious activity, blown up profits over 30% on their books. They underestimated risk, and they've begun to pay a heavy price for that. I am very interested in your opinion as an auditor. Do you find it rather interesting that we can't get at that paper, even though the American people are the recipient of all the mistakes? Our mortgages aren't being worked out at the local level. J.P. Morgan Chase is the worst forecloser in my district, including through one of its affiliates called Plymouth, all right? And yet they can dump their paper, and theoretically, a lot of it moves through Freddie and Fannie, and yet behind these walls of the Fed, we can't get at that. And so I'm saying to myself, as I look at a capable individual like yourself and your staff, you're never going to get at the truth, because they divided up the turf in such a way that you can never tell us the whole. How do you respond to that concern of mine? How do we get the whole truth?
I mean, I think that it should be no surprise at this point that I agree wholeheartedly that more transparency is better than less, that the more information that is out there for policymakers and the American people, the better. Because it's not related to a TARP program, it's outside of our scope and our jurisdiction.
But you're saying it's unrelated, yet the Fed has just hired, I believe, BlackRock to help to resolve, whatever that means, the Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae paper. And let me just quote from the Washington Post. Freddie Mac's alleged manipulation and accounting errors caused it to understate profit by 30.5% in 2000 and 42.9% in 2002, and to overstate profit by 23.9% in 2001. These manipulations include transactions that shifted windfall earnings into later periods when it might have been hard for the company to meet Wall Street expectations. My point is, I don't see how we can know the whole truth, and this troubles me, Mr. Chairman, because even the Seeger report today, Seeger-Tarp report today is there's so many agencies. It's like they've divvied us up into 1,000 pieces, just like they did the derivatives, so we can never know the truth. How do we get our arms around the whole? How do we do that? Can you think about that?
I think that the question is best addressed to the Inspector General for the Federal Reserve, as well as the Inspector General for excuse me, it's a long morning, FHFA, who oversees the conservatorship of Fannie and Freddie, and they would be in a better position, since these things are under their jurisdiction, to help you find the answers.
From a federal government standpoint, are you disallowed from working together?
Oh, no, we do coordinate together. Those Inspector Generals are both on part of my TARP IG Council, because they do have actions that impact the TARP, and I'm part of the Financial Regulatory IG Council, and we do talk and do coordinate with one another where our interests intersect. Here, this is sort of apart from the TARP program, so I don't really have an ability to go in and look at that information.
Gentlewoman's time has expired, but I think she makes a great case as to why the Inspector General should have independence. And I agree, when there's $23.7 trillion is at stake, I think that it's important that we make certain that they are independent. Let me thank you, Mr. Borowski, for your testimony, and I appreciate the interest of the members who attended today's hearing. Earnings at the largest bank and the bank holding companies such as J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs are up, yet lending remains down. It is unacceptable that profits go up while lending goes down. The taxpayers have invested very large amounts of money in these banks, but what have we gotten in return? It remains unclear. The taxpayers deserve to know how their tax dollars are being spent. The Treasury Department needs to publish full and detailed information on the use of TARP funds and publish the value of TARP portfolio on a monthly basis. They have that information and they should make it public. Moreover, Treasury also requires the largest banks to file monthly reports showing the dollar value of their new lending. That should be made public also. If Treasury does not put this information up on its website, this committee will. And if Treasury does not turn over this information voluntarily, Secretary Geithner will be brought before the committee to explain why not. What we have heard today convinces me that one of the best things Congress did when it created the TARP was to also create the Special Inspector General to oversee TARP spending. I can now understand why the Treasury Department would like to rein in SIGTARP, but we are not going to let that happen. You've heard from the members on this committee today in terms of their commitment. Again, I thank our witness, Mr. Borowski. Finally, please let the record demonstrate my submission of a binder with documents relating to this hearing. Without objections, I enter this binder into the committee records. And without objection, the committee stand adjourned. Thank you, Mr. Borowski, for your time and the information that you shared with us. Thank you.